Of course, I love all my presenters, particularly seeing a couple of the previous ones are sitting in the room. I love all our presenters, but of course, it's a particular pleasure to have Lesley presenting because we're working together on this work, although I'll deny all responsibility when it comes to nasty questions. And Lesley was a doctoral student with me, but and of course all doctoral students are wonderful. However, there are the unusual ones where for more than 10 years before they became your doctoral student, you were citing their work, which was the case with Lesley. So, it was a great pleasure when she joined us to do the doctorate, and it's a great pleasure to be working with her now. And this is about the agenda that we're working on, particularly with UNESCO, but with other organisations. Anyway, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. I want to say thank you very much, everybody, for coming. It's not often you get to talk about vocational education and training, which I will be calling VET in this presentation, in a school of education. So I really appreciate that you're here. Looking around the room, a lot of you work in schooling, some of you work in higher education, a few of you work in VET, so thanks a lot for just being here. The presentation that I'm doing today draws from and builds on a body of work that we've been working on over the last few years. In fact, there's a longer trajectory that Simon hinted at, which goes back really 15 years, but the theoretical framework that I'm going to be talking about today really comes out of the last few years' work. Mainly it comes out of my thesis, the work I did in the thesis, and also the work I've been doing in the postdoc in the year after the thesis. Simon and I have done a lot of writing, a lot of thinking, and a lot of putting our heads together about the problems that the sector faces. And as you can see from the publication list, we kind of published together quite a bit. So it feels a bit strange to be doing this presentation without him, because in some ways he's a very big part of the content of this presentation. But I'll forge ahead and you'll jump in whenever he feels like it. So Simon, I might have to curb you at points though, because I've got a presentation and we'll have to do that. The focus of my work is on VET in developing context. So I want to start by just giving you a little bit of a history of it. So this is one slide of half a century of movement, so it's quite ridiculous. The history of VET, and particularly the history of VET in developing context, has never been succinctly covered. There are sketches here and there in various countries, and putting these together, you get a bit of a sense of the trajectory. But this is a piece of work that somebody who's interested in the history of education might want to grapple with at some point. For much of the past half century though, and particularly in Africa, VET was not perceived as a viable policy option for social and economic development. Mainly for three reasons. The first being the sociological argument, and this was driven by the work of Foster in the 1960s, quantitative work that he did in Ghana that looked at student aspirations, who argued that students neither aspire to VET and neither are they really that successful at VET. And then there were economic arguments in the 1980s by Zachariopoulos for the World Bank, who argued that the cost-benefit analysis showed that VET just made absolutely no sense as a development option in developing contexts. The argument being that it made a lot more sense to throw your money at schooling than to throw it at VET. And then there have been instrumental arguments about the quality and the relevance of VET. In 1977, a South African writer called Malherbe, who did a very deep history of South Africa's education system from the 1920s, described VET as mother's last hope. And I think for people who think about VET, that kind of captures the feeling that we have about what vocational education and training is about. In 2000 in South Africa, expenditure on VET was extremely low, as it was in much of the rest of Africa and much of the rest of the developing world. In fact, it was about 1.8% of educational spend. It's work that we did, so the figure's a bit dodgy. It might be 1.5 or it might be 2, but approximately that's the direction. It was a very small margin of what the total educational spend was. There's been a massive change over the last decade, and particularly over the last half decade, with VET really seen as a central instrument for addressing poverty alleviation, social inclusion, youth unemployment, and economic growth. Across the developing world, there's been an increased commitment to expand and rapidly expand participation. So in South Africa, for example, the government ambition is to expand this sector by 150% over the next decade. The time frames keep shifting, but that's approximately the space we're looking at. In India, the idea is to expand VT over the next decade to 500 million. This is a crazy number of people within a VT system. The current system has 3 million students, give or take, within the system. So this is massive, massive expansion. A quick look at donor sites and a quick sense of where people are throwing their money at shows that quite a few of the donors who were not supporting VT over the last 20 years are now putting money into it, are now making it a priority. The World Bank has vacillated. They've been quite keen to, they've been not keen to, they've been quite keen to, they've moved backwards and forwards. But effectively, if you look at if you follow the money, follow the purse, that's what they say, what you'll see is that the World Bank has increased their funding to VT markedly over the last decade. So we've got this funny contradiction existing, which Simon has written about quite a bit, which is between this policy trajectory, which is all about supporting VT, expanding VT, and you see it in the UK as well, isn't it, in the further education college sector. And on the other hand, a literature which talks about the quality of VT, the problems with VT in terms of its relevance, in terms of student aspirations to be there in the first place, and more recent arguments about the unemployability of students who come out of the VT sector. So with poverty alleviation seen as a central driver of VT, one of the questions that we're now faced with is, what is this relationship between VT and poverty? How does VT really begin to make a difference in poverty? And poverty has become it's become so linked to VT that you can scarcely open a document on Google which doesn't say VT and poverty alleviation within at least the same paragraph. Do a search. Rebecca, your work is in this area. Do a search, do a scan, and it's surprising, it's shocking how these two terms have become coupled. But they're not neutral terms, are they? And they're not easy terms either. And there's a history behind these terms. In Malherb's work in South Africa, he defined vocational education, he described it as something that was never seriously applied to the well-to-do. It was always to be the mental reservation. Work is honourable for the poor, but dishonourable for the well-to-do. VT has always been about the poor, and it has always been for the poor. This is a donor. Skills development can play an important role in reducing poverty. Skills can contribute to lifting individuals out of poverty by improving access to work, improving productivity, fostering national economic growth. But these statements about what VT can do for poverty, they're not neutral statements at all. And they've been contested by philosophers, by sociologists who say, hold on, wait a minute. There's something wrong with the system which has different goals for different groups of children, with poor children on the vocational side and wealthy children on the liberal side. There's something wrong with the system which begins to funnel people to particular categories within the labour market. So these are the different debates that have sat within vocational education and training and poverty. These debates, though, are fading or have faded to the background. What has come to the forefront is the assumption that VT and poverty alleviation are coupled, that by increasing participation in VT, what you do is you begin to address poverty alleviation. And this is how it happens in terms of the assumptions. The first assumption is that training will lead to productivity, which will lead to economic growth. The neoliberal argument, isn't it? Training leads to improved economic growth by improving government spending on social services, which then improves jobs and increases the number of jobs, which then leads to poverty alleviation. The trickle-down argument. The problems with this argument is well noted. There's a massive literature that talks to it, so I won't go into it here. The second assumption is that skills lead to employability, which lead to jobs. Very crude set of logics is that skills will enable a graduate to have the attitudes, to have the demeanors, to have the set of requirements necessary to enter the workforce. Having a job will then enable the person to move out of poverty. And we know that's not true, don't we? We know that there are people with PhDs who are unemployed. We know that there are people who are highly skilled in parts of our world that simply don't have a job, quite frankly, because there aren't jobs. we know that even when people do work, that working doesn't necessarily mean a sustainable life by a long shot. All over Europe, you have the working poor who work 7 days a week but who simply can't survive on what they're earning. So the idea that skills lead to employability, which leads to poverty alleviation, is a crude set of logics. Unfortunately, it's also the most dominant set of logic which underpins VT. The set of logics which has become so grounded in VT that we don't question it. And it's rarely questioned within the documentation that comes from our policymakers, be they at international or national level, that comes from our donor community, or that comes from our business community, or for that matter, that comes from our citizens, or that comes from the students who are involved in this sector either. So this has led to a particular vision of what the problems of VET are. It resulted in a critique of VET as ineffective and inefficient, with a number of tools being developed to measure progress in efficiency and inefficiency, which Simon has called the VET toolkit. It's a set of tools which really enables you to look at the performance management aspect, enables you to measure progress along a set of indicators over a period of time. And to some extent, yes, there's something right about the fact that there are institutions that are just not cutting it, they're not doing that well. And there's also something really crude in this critique. There's something really crude in blaming an educational system for the inability of young people to get jobs. There's something really crude in blaming an educational system for the increased poverty in our world. Something really crude about blaming an educational system for the extent to which inequality hasn't reduced. Political ambitions against the backdrop of these sets of assumptions have been to rapidly expand VET systems. And when I say rapidly, I mean rapidly. I think the Indian example is the most extreme. 3 million to 500 million in a decade. That's crazy. I mean, that's absolutely mad. The idea being if you put more people in, you give more people access, more people will be poverty alleviated. That's assumptions, really. There's a commitment to public management approaches to VET institutions, often combined with centralization and driven by evaluation as a key instrument. VET institutions themselves are under continual pressure to transform. The institutions, the staff therein keep talking about how they struggle just to keep pace with the changes, management changes, regulation changes, curriculum changes, which are pretty much constant. And in the sector that I've based my empirical work on, which is in South Africa, we speak about transformation fatigue because it's a sector that suffers it, and I know that the FE sector in Britain has the same problem. So in short, this is what the story is about. VET is ineffective, we've got to make it more effective. Problem, that's a solution. The pass rates are too low, the participation rates are too low, throughput rates are too low, we've got to increase quality. We've got to get training for the lecturers, increase quality. They're not providing the right training for the right employment. We've got to get the labour market educational mix right. We've got to get the pathways right. We've got to study what these labour markets need. We've spent 75 million on a project in South Africa which is precisely about studying these pathways. Absolutely crazy amount of money to try and study these pathways. Simon has worked on the project, study these pathways in order that we can understand how we can better fit them together. I'm not saying that knowledge is not useful, but I'm saying that knowledge has particular limitations to it, and it has assumptions about how the world works that sits underneath it. And if we can't just improve these things, then VET, if we can just improve these things, then VET can start doing its job. That's really the policy story. That's a generic policy story. That's a dominant policy story. And I think you would go far in the world to find a policy framework that in fact isn't underpinned by this set of logics. So UNESCO last year came up with the notion of a transformed and transformative VET, and it's a piece of work that Simon was working on quite closely. And the more I look at this text, and I've never asked you this, but the more this text absolutely looks like you. And UNESCO's notion is of a transformative VET that is radically transformed, with the target of VET changing from economics to individuals, to the well-being of individuals. But it is also transformative in that it does not adapt to current work and societal changes, but aims to challenge and transform those. So working within the framework of this more nuanced idea of what VET could possibly be about, leads us to another set of questions. What is it to be transformed away from? What is it to be transformed into? And how is it to play this transformative role? So what I want to talk to today is less about the answer to these questions. I think they're really important questions. I think they're questions that should be on every government's agenda. I think they're questions that should be on every donor's agenda. I think they're questions, rather, that we should really be thinking about and engaging with and grappling with when we deal with the donor community, because they're questions that really matter. And they're going to be mattering to millions of young people around the world. But I don't want to try and answer those questions today. I want to talk about the approach that I developed in my PhD and during the postdoc year that I've spent here as possible ways that we can use to answering these questions. So I've used a critical realist lens, and I've used a capability approach. So we're going to do a quick, I've actually got, as you can see, 2 slides on critical realism. Critical realism is a massive body of literature. It's a body of literature which has got contestations within itself. It's not a body of literature where everybody agrees with each other by a long shot. It's a complex body of literature. So this is a quick dip in and a quick dip out to what this literature has brought to this topic. And maybe I'll interest you to go and have a look at critical realism yourself and to think about it as an approach for your own work. I've spoken about it quite a bit in my thesis, and then you've also used it in your PhD as well. So a few of us have used this approach. The biggest idea that came from critical realism, in fact it comes from other schools of thought as well, is that what we know about VT and how we have come to this knowing is fundamentally affected by what we take to be knowable. This idea that what we take to be knowable is in fact fallible, that knowledge itself is fallible, is a strongly social realist argument. The argument being that reality exists on different strata, and that there's a difference between the knowledge that we develop about reality and the actual reality that exists. So if you think that the Earth is flat, it doesn't necessarily mean that the Earth is flat, you know. It might very well be that the Earth is in fact round. There's a difference between how we understand that reality and what is the reality. The job of research from a critical realist perspective is to try and get closer to that reality. And there are methodological suggestions made about approaches that you can use about achieving that. But once you begin to start questioning your knowledge base and saying, hold on a minute, this is the knowledge base in VT, but maybe there's something wrong here. You know, there's a few cracks in this knowledge base. What are these cracks about? The second point you begin to get to is that knowledge is absolutely and completely not neutral. The human capital and neoliberal conceptions that underpin VT, for example, is contested by organizations, by NGOs, and by the research community. One of the quotes that I particularly like is one that describes neoliberalism as a mode of pedagogy, a set of social arrangements that uses education to win consent, reduce consumer-based notions of agency, and militarize reasons in the service of war, profits, power, violence, while simultaneously instrumentalizing all forms of knowledge. It's as Michael Young says, we really can't avoid questions about the origins of theoretical and empirical knowledge and the significance of recognizing that it is neither in the head nor in the world, but inescapably a product of human beings acting in history in the world. Critical realism, particularly through the work of Archer, also brought an alternate view of structure and agency. People are seen as interacting with rather than being subjected to structure, and as having the power to transform their worlds. This is a massive shift from the way in which we talk about people within the vocational education and training world, isn't it? What we do in VT is we talk about the economy, we talk about the institutions, we talk about these poor people and what they need, but in fact we don't talk about the agency. We don't really understand how these people conceptualize the worlds that they live in and how they maneuver and how they move and how this maneuvering and movement is shaped by their understanding of this world. We don't understand much about these learners, in fact, at all. It also has methodological implications. It challenges the crude deductivist logic which underpins so much of vocational education and training research, which is located in the idea of causality which goes from an observed X to a deduced conclusion of Y. This is the scientific model. And again, there's a big body of literature that talks to what the problems and limitations of this understanding of causality is. Despite this literature, this is in fact the dominant mode within VET. And it's a dominant mode in quite a lot of other policy areas of research as well, actually. It prioritizes, critical realism prioritizes mixed methods research. And it changes the mode of inference from an inductive or deductivist logic to an adductive or retroductive inference. And the big difference is that it starts with a theory of the context, and then it considers the extent to which it fits into the case. So it moves backwards. It starts off with your y, if you like, and then it begins to look at what your x's could be. Maybe it's x1, or maybe it's x2, maybe it's a combination of x2 and x3. But it's a very different way to analyze your data. It's a completely different lens. That was not my end of the thing. It's a completely different lens to what has been used in VET research, and it's a completely, radically different lens to the way in which you would do deductivist work, or for that matter, inductivist work. Using this framework led to renewed engagement and assessment of the paradigmatic, the epistemological, the ontological, and the methodological foundations of knowledge in VET, and began to challenge the way in which we'd constructed that knowledge, began to challenge the assumptions, the methodologies that we'd used in developing this knowledge. So the second framework that I use is the human capability approach. I want to start off by saying that this is not a theory. You know, the capability approach is often critiqued as a theory for not engaging enough with power or not engaging enough with understandings of structure and agency. But in fact, this is not what it's trying to do. The capability approach is more of an ontology. It's a way of understanding. It's a way of defining what is development. And it serves as a reference point to what development could be, what it should be, and our progress towards it can be evaluated. The most well-known index is probably the Human Development Index, but it's also the crudest version of the capability approach around. So the heart of the capability approach is a commitment to the dignity and well-being of each and every person. It's about providing people with the opportunities to live lives that they value and enabling them to become agents in their lives. It develops a framework for illuminating how the social, material, and institutional conditions mediate how people experience skills, how they understand skills, and how they are able to convert skills into opportunities that matter. Two concepts that are critical in the capability approach is the notion of functionings and the notion of capabilities. Functionings talk to your achievements. It talks to the achievements that an individual is actually experiencing, the observed achievements, if you like. And when you look at educational assessments, educational evaluations, and when you look at work that's been done in vocational education and training, for the most part, the focus is precisely on functionings. How many graduates gained employment? How many passed? What were their achievements in terms of X or Y or Z? But capabilities adds another lens. It adds this notion of capabilities. And what this term refers to are the opportunities that matter to an individual. What a person is able to do and to be, and the ability to choose from these beings and doings. So it's not simply about what they are, but it's about what they have the opportunities to be. So if you become a teacher quite simply because you have no other option in your life, because your parents told you to do that, or because you've been instructed to do that and your options are limited, you've had a very different set of capabilities to somebody else who's elected to be a teacher from a range and an array of options and opportunities that were available to them. Similarly for a VET student, if you become a student because there are no other options available to you, it's a very different thing to, in fact, if you had other options available to you. So this separation between capabilities and functionings might appear on the surface of it to be splitting hairs. It's between opportunities, which is something that is not easy to measure because it's not easily observable. It's an unobservable variable, actually. And between functionings, which is an observable variable. Why this distinction? The heart of it is that it's essential for identifying inequalities. By focusing on functionings only, you misunderstand the freedoms that people have to elect and select a life that they would like to live, a life that they appreciate, a life of value. It identifies differences in individuals' ability to convert resources to functioning. So you might have a set of skills, and this is really useful, that you can hammer away at X, or you can use a lathe, or you can do whatever. These might be skills that you're quite competent at, but in fact there isn't a single job for you in the labor market, or you don't know how to access it, or you're just not the kind of person that the labor market likes to employ because you're female and they prefer to employ men, whatever. It helps you to identify what within individuals, as well as what external to individuals, makes it difficult to convert these resources to functionings. And it allows us to understand poverty as multidimensional. You know, when we talk about poverty in this VT poverty nexus that's being thrown around everywhere and that donors are now throwing money at, the understanding of poverty is a very narrow understanding. It's an understanding of poverty as being income deprivation, but in fact, poverty is much more than that. It's deprivation across multiple dimensions. It's a poverty in the way in which you can aspire. It's poverty in the way in which you understand the worlds that are possible for you. It's poverty in the way in which you understand how to learn, how to orientate yourself with respect to the labor market or a learning pathway, an educational pathway. There are so many different poverties. And what the capability approach has done through its engagement with people has been to understand these different pathways. Again, there's a literature, and there's a bit that we've written, which cites some of that literature that you can have a look at to get more information. But by shifting your notion of poverty away from a crude income, a limited income definition, you begin to think a little bit more about what are these institutions supposed to be doing for poor students then. Surely then it's a bit more than simply trying to train for employability. Maybe, is it? It stresses the difference between means and ends and says quite clearly and most emphatically and quite unapologetically that if your job and if your task and if you are proclaiming that your purpose is to deal with poverty, then deal with poverty. Don't say we're going to go roundabout to poverty and we're going to try and get jobs and that will lead to poverty. Go directly and measure that, look at that, focus on that, make that your horizon so that you keep that quite clear in your head. And it's quite unapologetic about doing that. It has a number of methodological implications for how we work, and I know that there's some people in the room are really interested in this component particularly, so I'm sorry it's such a small piece of a slide. I'm drawing here on Bonrin's and Galster's work on the capability approach, and what they've done is to split it into two major areas that it affects the way methodologies happen. The first is what they've called the substantial level, and here the argument is that the information on which we base our research is not neutral. The indicators, the aspects that we decide to focus on, these are not really neutral. Decisions are made in this process of what we are going to include, but most importantly, decisions are made about what we are not going to include. Information sets should, they argue, be based on capabilities, on the opportunities that matter, the valued opportunities that matter to people. It should be based on the valued functionings, on the achievements that matter to individuals and communities, we would argue. And it should be based on the freedom to utilize those opportunities and achieve those functionings. It should be based on identifying the factors that constrain and enable the above as well. The argument linked to the centrality of agency in the capability approach is that public debate and deliberation on what this knowledge base needs to focus on needs to be held. That in fact it's not okay for a specialist to come in and to just say these are the 10 factors that we're focusing on and this is what we think the game is about. You really need to talk to people and find out what matters to them, and drawing from that base develop a set of indicators, if you like, or areas of focus, or what matters to people that you can now rotate your research around. So using these two frameworks, which I've rushed through, 2 slides for capabilities, 2 slides for critical realism. Using these two frameworks, what we've done is what it's helped us do is to develop and envisage an alternate paradigmatic framework for looking at, for conceptualizing, for envisaging the future of VT. It's an alternate focus in terms of purpose For us, the well-being and the development of students are now the center of our concern. Institutional change matters, as does macroeconomic policy, as does the labor market, as does the interface between these institutions and the labor market. But ultimately, it's the well-being and the development of those students that are the center of our concern. We've defined the purpose of VET and the job of VET within this framework as being to expand students' opportunities through either making a change in students' reasoning, their values, their beliefs, their attitudes, a difference in their resources, for example, the information or the skills that they have access to, and in dimensions that matter to them, by making a difference, but also by making a difference to people's understanding of how they can use and access this reasoning and these resources. But changing the focus in this way from an economic-driven focus to a human-driven focus, what we find is that the purpose of research has changed. It's now about determining the factors at the individual, institutional, and policy level that constrain or enable the expansion of valued capabilities and functionings. It's all about what makes a difference to people's lives. And this has led to an alternate set of questions. I'll give you a minute to flip through them. But effectively, it's about which opportunities and functionings matter to VET students. To what extent are these being met? To what extent are these being constrained? But it's also led to an alternate way of answering these questions, so a different information set, a different process, a different degree of agency. It suggested a shift away from deductivist approaches towards abductivist approaches. It suggests a shift away from the prioritization in VET research of quantitative research only towards mixed methods. Coming out of this, we've developed one model. It's one of many models, and I'm not going to spend too much time talking about it today because I think it's quite complex. But just as a quick walkthrough, this notion of endowments talks to the capacities and the abilities of an institution or an institution or an individual. And what this model has allowed us to do is we're going to unpack not just the crude story that the policymakers and the literature carry so far, which is that functionings is what matters, institutional endowments, what institutions can do, and how this leads to functionings is really where the story is located. But it's begun to unpack that it's so much more complex. That in fact learners can't necessarily use the institutional facilities that are made available to them. They can't get there, there are constraints at home, they don't have food, whatever the obstacles are, but they're not necessarily able to use these institutional facilities when they're provided. It shows that even graduates are not necessarily able to utilize their skills, their knowledges, and their attitudes. And it shows that these are shaped by environmental as well as agential factors. We've written a paper on this, and it's on my academia site, so if anybody wants to have a look at it, you can look at it, and we unpack it there. The point of the story, though, is that using the capabilities approach combined with critical realism has enabled us to bring structure to the forefront. It's enabled us to talk a much broader story about VET whilst not neglecting agency. You know, you really can't talk about vocational education and training in the developing world. You certainly can't talk about it in Africa without talking about the World Bank neoliberal policies, for example. I mean, you certainly can't talk about it without talking about the IMF and the impact that that has had on countries' economies. You can't talk about it without talking about the World Trade Organization and what trade regulations have done and are doing to the well-being of these countries, the economic well-being of these countries. So for sure, these are very important discussions. And in South Africa, you can't talk about VET and the labor market without talking about our GAIR policies, which is a neoliberal policy that came in 1996. So yes, these are important discussions and they need to be held, but what we wanted to do was to not limit our discussion to these frameworks, but to recognize that people move, that people are agents and they maneuver, they move and they shift systems in important and in powerful ways, and to contain and restrain your story at that point is a story which is disempowering to people within developing contexts. It's disempowering to our VET students. It's disempowering to the people who participate in the sector in South Africa but in other places of the world as well. So this is one approach for answering a question that is not being asked often enough deeply enough, and certainly not being engaged with in enough spaces. And it's just that it's one lens, you know. In a publication 2 years ago, Simon was saying that we need multiple voices and multiple approaches in thinking about DT and development. And this is absolutely true. This is one of the challenges and one of the struggles that we're facing in trying to draw more interest into this area. So it's an area that's very exciting, it's very interesting. So doing a little sell for people to think about, not just schooling and higher education, but begin to think about vocational education as a real sector, because it is a real sector. And not to think about it as a sector that deals with other people's children in other countries on the other side of the world, or other people's children in other sides of the city, but in fact to think about it as a sector that is located within a broader set of policy frameworks that in fact affect not only yourself, but will be affecting your children as well. I want to end with a quote that I really like. And before I do that, you know, I really want to just take a minute to thank the school for having supported this work. My PhD was funded by this school. I had a studentship from the School of Education, which is really, thank God, because it would have been really hard to do this work without it. And my postdoc was also funded by the school. And the fact that this presentation starts and ends with a quote from Simon is really not by chance. It's Simon's own work has been fundamental to the way in the trajectory that this work has taken, and we're working together, so we affect each other as time goes. We will continue to affect each other as time goes on in terms of where we take this work to. So I want to end with a quote that I really like by Frederick Douglass. It's those who profess to favour freedom and yet depreciate agitation are people who want crops without ploughing the ground. They want rain without thunder and lightning. They want the ocean without the roar of its many waters. The struggle may be a moral one, or it may be a physical one, or it may be both, but it must be a struggle. Power concedes nothing without a demand. It never did, and it never will. As educators, it's our job to empower people to make that demand. And as researchers, it's our job to shape the discourse of that demand. It may seem as if what we do is so little, you know, just a grain of sand or a little seed. But seeds become trees and trees become forests. So in all the areas that you work in, each one of us, keep ploughing, keep roaring, keep thundering, because I think it matters. Thanks.